woman. Okay.
Welcome everyone to the Friday Transportation Seminar. Today we'll hear from Joe Broach, a research associate here in the Transportation Research and Education Center at PSU. He's also an instructor in the Tulane School of Urban Studies and Planning. Joe?
Hey, Sarah. Well, thanks everyone for coming in on a beautiful day, although it's starting to cloud up a little bit. I know we're also competing at the Student Research Symposium that's going on, so it's great to see all of you here. I'm Joe Broach, and what I'm going to do today is a little different for me. Usually I'm developing maybe one model or one data technique that I hope that planners and practitioners will end up crossing paths with at some point. And for this project, we're in a different vein in trying to speak directly to practice based on some of the work that me and my colleagues have done here at PSU, as well as a broad scan of work that's going on multimodal network connectivity. And I should share that someone noted this morning that if my slide deck failed to load, I could probably make most of the points using my shirt as the network pattern. And I decided to just take that as a compliment and go from there. I'd like to acknowledge the rest of the team here at Portland State that also worked to make this guidebook happen. Kelly Clifton, you know, is here. Dr. Jennifer Dill was a key component on the project, as well as former MERT and current planner there, lost in Portland State. And FHWA sponsored the project, and we had lots of consulting partners. It took a lot to, it takes a lot to make a guidebook like this happen, a lot of people. So with that, the motivation of this project was interesting in that it really came from questions that the Federal Highway Administration was hearing from their parties. These questions that they didn't feel like they really had the toolkit to answer. They were really excited to dive into. So I just want to give you some examples of the type of questions that drove this project. In Atlanta, how do we identify projects that will better serve local centers, both urban and suburban, and in a consistent way? It's something that didn't fit their kind of traditional planning tools. In the city of Baltimore, we got a complete sidewalk inventory, but we need another that's actually sensitive to policies in Baltimore for planning and benchmarking. Caltrans, a state agency, mostly in charge of running pretty high capacity roads, they started to realize that even though we're not in the business of local bicycle facilities, our facilities are affecting them. How are the state highways impacting local bicycle access? How do we answer that question for and direct our planning efforts to improving it? City of Fort Collins, a very different place than some of these other ones. They wanted to take the next step. They were already measuring bicycle network connectivity in a pretty sophisticated way, but it wasn't really allowing them to see how the network was evolving over time. How are we doing better? Is the quality increasing, and by how much? Portland Metro, here in our home region, they wanted to look more from a bird's eye regional view. They do a lot of in-depth modeling and planning at disaggregate scale, but they kind of just wanted to know, zoom out, and in our regional transportation plan, are our projects meeting the needs in terms of filling gaps in the network? How do we do that stuff? And so all of this kind of boils down to the motivation that a lot of agencies have had in wanting to move beyond this inventory mindset where the output metric each year or each planning cycle is how many new miles of facilities did we build or are we going to build. That was just starting to fall flat, both internally in the agencies and we heard quite often it was falling flat with stakeholders and the public. They wanted more. They knew that more complex methods were available and they wanted to see it. They didn't want to know just 10 miles of bike lanes, but where and why did we choose those locations, and is that the right facility for those areas? So that was the motivation for FHWA to sponsor this particular guidebook. And we came in with the idea that measuring connectivity could help agencies do several things or do several things better. One was just understanding the value of individual facility. So the Tillicum crossing doesn't even add a mile of bike infrastructure in Portland, but clearly it's much more important than many other quarter miles that you could add throughout the network. Also, just getting at the final goal of all of this, right, is not to build as many miles of bicycle or pedestrian facility as possible. It's to get people where they need to go, and people of all ages and abilities. And then finally, just getting a sense or a measure or a concept of what is the overall quality of a network, either in pieces or taken all together. We want to see something that gives us a score of sort of how we're doing. And so from that, we kind of defined our goals for the project. And like I said, we had a fairly large team spread across a couple of consulting agencies, Portland State, and then to support the federal highways. And we kind of came up with these as our 5 goals for the project, and that's how I'm going to organize the talk today. The first is just to define what it is. It turns out it's not as simple a concept as maybe we think it is when we start thinking about it. So defining what connectivity analysis is, and then we wanted to do a scan, not a complete survey, but just a scan in research and practice of what tools were already out there and methods. How was connectivity being measured for bike and ped travel at this point? And then we wanted to kind of move beyond that and to kind of provide a menu of options, because one thing that federal highways have been hearing is lots of agencies have connectivity as a goal, but when they actually get around the table and start thinking, okay, now how are we going to measure how we do that, that they realize that they didn't really have a go-to method or tool or even a concept of what it was that makes a network connected or not. And then we wanted to document this in actual planning context, because it's one thing to do something in a research setting or a kind of one-off, but how does it actually fit into a live planning process? So we were going to kind of helicopter in, look over shoulders, and help a little bit in ongoing planning in some different agencies around the country. And those are the agencies that I led off with. So you've already gotten introduced to our 5 case study agencies that I'll talk about a bit more. And then finally, we wanted to the best of our ability, to kind of find a way to transfer the lessons we learned from those agencies. There was also some more data we collected that I'll talk about in a minute, and then come up with some, I would call them emerging best practices recommendations. This is still a fluid area in both research and practice, I would say, measuring the connectedness of networks, but it's getting to the point that we can at least talk about some things that are working well and some pitfalls. So the rest of my talk will be kind of going through these 5 areas in more or less detail in the time we have. But all of this, I hope, is to whet your appetite a little bit for actually taking a look at the guidebook. I think as these types of documents go, this one is very approachable, and it was written in a way that we hoped at least that people from a broad range of experience in research and practice would find a section that they could really sink their teeth in. So if you're a student doing research in this area, I think you'll find just the explanation of connectivity analysis, how it can work, how the pieces fit together, very useful. If you're more on the practice side, I think you'll find something as well. So this is kind of how we went about it from in a broad way. Like I said, we tried to get a scan of what was going on, and to do that, we reviewed a fair number of planning documents of academic research, and credit there goes a lot to our graduate research assistant, Claire. And we did that up front so that we went into it before we started talking to agencies and selecting case studies and interviews of having a sense of where connectivity was being done and in what ways for bicycle and pedestrians. And then we invited 5 agencies to kind of join us in the study, and we provided them with some technical support, but they already had an ongoing planning process where they had set connectivity as one of the outcome goals. So we jumped into live planning processes. I'll give you one example in a little more detail. You saw the questions that the other agencies were asking. The companion to the guidebook is a documents those case studies a little bit more fully. But those case studies took place with Caltrans in California, with Portland Metro, Fort Collins, Colorado, Baltimore, the city of Baltimore, and then the Atlanta Regional Commission. We also followed that up to get a little bit more breadth from the planning documents we reviewed. We selected 8 agencies to get the right staff on the phone, and myself and a couple of other of our team did extended phone interviews with these agencies to kind of talk us through how the connectivity measurement project process went for them. And that was very enlightening as well. And you notice Portland is represented again. We talked with TriMet here, who developed a really innovative planning tool for bicycle and pedestrian access to transit. And you see a number of other agencies across the country represented as well. So, all that said, this is the big question, right? What is network connectivity? And I think for a lot of us, we kind of, we might struggle with the definition, but as planners or engineers or whatever field that you are related to those two, you sort of feel like you know it when you see it. And any planners, I'm sure in the room, have seen the classic maps showing curvilinear suburban development versus the gridded urban development. And I mean, which one is more connected, the one on the left or the one on the right? The one on the right. We feel like we know it. Now, I would probably agree with you, at least in terms of potential connectivity, but the picture gets a little more complicated when you want to look at it in different ways. So what if we then start thinking about the quality or the facilities available on the network, right? So what if we now know that it's not just the grid of streets, but we have improved or modified those streets to better accommodate cyclists? Now, the question, you might have the same answer, but all of a sudden you're maybe a little bit less certain of it. And also, how much more connected is the one on the right than the one on the left? Or is it vice versa now? We're still probably missing a piece, though. It gets more complicated than that, because we also have to think about where the network is trying to take you from where to where, right? So what if we now add on top of that, schools and parks or any number of destinations, employment areas, and you start realizing that, well, maybe I wouldn't always know it when I saw it. I may not be able to pick the winner, and I definitely couldn't say that, the one on the left is twice as connected than the one on the right, or vice versa. It gets complicated, and that's without layering other things in that are important to people walking and biking, like the terrain, the traffic volumes, the intersection crossings. All of these things matter. We know that from a lot of research and, of course, from practical experience. But it's hard to quantify. So, if nothing else, I hope it helps you understand that it depends on how you measure it and what you're measuring for, right? So, we, after reviewing everything and talking to a lot of people, we found that connectivity analysis that was being done pretty much fell into 4 categories, with and without a sort of quality overlay. And so as you move down the left side, these are the 4 main categories of how people are conceptualizing a connected network for bicyclists and pedestrians. Is it complete? How much of the network is available to people walking or biking? So interstates are out, controlled access roads, that sort of thing, just as a baseline. Second, how dense is it? Because we know from lots of long lineage of urban planning research that denser networks tend to go along with a lot of things, and one of those is more walking and biking. So how much of the network is there in a given area? How frequently are you going to run into an alternative route to take, right? Then we're getting more complex now. We get into the directness of routes. Can you go directly from A to B via the network, or do you have to go far out of your way, which is going to be a deterrent to walking and biking? And then finally, the end goal, which doesn't always have to be the way to conceptualize connectivity, at least I'll make that case, but eventually you want to understand if people can actually get to where they want to go by walking and biking. Because if all they can do is access random points on the network, well, that's probably not enough to get someone to give up a driving trip or to, you know, to take an extra walking trip. So those are kind of the categories, but then there's another dimension to that, and I think we're becoming more and more aware of it. I'm sure it's not news to you, but to be honest, 10 years ago, it sort of was news. We kind of thought of bicyclists and pedestrians, but we didn't really think of the range of them. And now in planning and in research, we're very focused on the fact that there are different types of users that have different comfort levels and different preferences for different facilities. So you've heard terms like 8 to 80 networks, or all ages networks, or all user networks. There's also a dimension here that we didn't get to go into depth in this report, but the accessibility dimension from a disabled user point of view is yet another layer on top. So as we move from left to right, we're getting more complex in the way we treat the quality of the connections. So a network can be a highly connected grid of streets with no bicycle facilities and no sidewalks. And while it has potential connectivity, the quality lets it down, right? And it's unlikely to be useful for many outside of those strong and fearless who would have biked or walked regardless. And so if you sort of look across the top there are three ways this happens. First is what I said, the naive. All streets that aren't specifically close to walking and biking or add connectivity to the network, right? And then you get to sort of the next level, which is kind of where I would say the practice is mostly at this point, which is, well, let's look at designated facilities. That's easy enough. So let's look at just the streets with sidewalks, right? Complete sidewalks for pedestrians, or some type of facility for bicyclists, right? So at least a painted bike lane there, which we know is not great for everyone, but it's something, right? That's kind of that middle column where, and you see how the scores can vary a lot. This is a little slice from downtown Portland, in fact, and now all of a sudden the scores are different when you look at the network from a different point of view of what's likely to be available or desired by users, right? And then finally we get to, here's called low stress, but really any way of measuring the network from that point of view of what would users like to see, what are they comfortable with, what's the apparent quality to them. And one way we talk about it often is a low stress network, one where cyclists or pedestrians have some separation from motor vehicle traffic for the most part, and you know, some protection at crossings and that sort of thing. So this is kind of, you know, this is the matrix that organizes our concept. There are simpler ways, there are more complex ways, and it really depends a lot on the question you're asking. So we also tried to sketch out the steps in the process because we found that there was, in a lot of cases, people were doing the analyses and finding they had kind of done something out of order, that they identified the planning context and then they chose this great method that they were really excited about, that maybe they saw a webinar somewhere, and then they realized, oh, we don't actually have the data for that. So it's an iterative process, but this is kind of, you know, this is a rough idea of how the steps align. You identify the context, what question you need to get from the connectivity analysis. You choose a method, you assemble the data, and sometimes that means collecting some of it. It's not always available. Compute some metrics, and then you have to package them in some way to make any sense. And this is this was probably in a way the newest piece, and I'll spend just a little time on that. You can run tools and measures and get all of these numbers, but if you can't aggregate them to a level that speaks to the question or that is sort of manageable, comprehensible, it doesn't really work out. So the last piece is really important, and that is either visualizing or quantifying results in some way that you can kind of act on. So you know, you're familiar enough with the basic sort of transportation planning process. This is just the way that FHWA conceptualizes it. But I think we use that to see where connectivity analysis was fitting into it. And it really boiled down to just a few things. So some sort of simpler things. It's being used to identify gaps in the network. Where could we make what may be a relatively small change in like length of facility, but might be a really important connection. In terms of thinking about needs and where they are spatially in your policy area. So where do they need it the most if we were going to target some investment? Where's connectivity the lowest? Now we're moving up to more moderate difficulty would be sort of monitor and benchmarking. There are a lot of agencies, like I said, they want to get away from, we had 100 miles of bike lane this year, now we have 110, so I guess it's 10% better, but they know that's not really quite the case. So they want to measure that they kind of track over time. And that's one thing that connectivity analysis can do if you do it consistently over time. And then the most difficult, which only a handful of agencies, although I'll say including Portland, are doing, is getting to the level where they can do scenario analysis. So before the new network is built, when you have 3 alternative ways to spend this transportation improvement money, which scenario is going to get you either a greater increase in connectivity or in the areas where you think it's most needed. There are lots of ways. That's the planning context, right, is what's most important to you. But connectivity can provide you some options, right? Rather than just looking at 3 things and passing it around the table, you can look at some numbers, some distributions, and understand the impact that it's probably going to have. And then finally, it's project prioritization, pretty closely related to scenario analysis. I can give the quick example of Metro, which used a bicycle connectivity tool to help them plan every access to the Sullivan's Gulch Trail, the one that's going to eventually run along 84, is pretty difficult, right? Because of the terrain, because of the railroad crossing and all of that. So they can't put an access everywhere they would like to. So which places should they prioritize? And they could use a connectivity analysis to help them understand that. Where does the existing bike network best funnel into that trail? That's where we should put our prioritization of building access. Then there's choosing the method, and there's not a right or a wrong one. There's just there are a range that kind of fall into 2 categories, and they have different complexity levels to kind of pull off, both in terms of data and the technical expertise. So in the guidebook, we've tried to arrange them in a way that agencies will understand kind of what they're getting into if they take this one on and what they can get out of them. You don't get something for nothing, but if you can pick the sort of right level of sophistication, you're well on your way. But we did find that the analysis methods that were available generally fell into 2 categories, and this is a really important distinction if you're a student thinking of doing some analysis like this, or if you're a practitioner. The simpler, more traditional methods tend to be form-based, meaning that they're really just based on the kind of shape and distribution of the network. So those are the things like I showed you before in terms of the density of sidewalks, the completeness of bicycle facilities. But the problem, and you can probably see it a little bit on the map, is you'll notice that map of sidewalk density and bicycle facility completeness, some of it probably looks about right to your eye, but some of it looks a little bit strange. So some of the suburban areas that look to score very highly, for instance, on bicycle facility completeness, and that's because in many of those areas they are very streets. It's a suburban curvilinear street which was built relatively recently, so it's subject to the rule that they add a bike lane on all of them. So they all have a bike lane, but that doesn't mean that the bike lane gets you anywhere. So these form-based measures have that problem that they really only get us to potential connectivity, right? So the quality is there, but it doesn't mean that it connects you to anything. It can also, the reverse can happen too in a gridded system where the grid gives high potential connectivity. There are lots of street intersections close together. You don't have to go out of your way, but if the quality is poor, if the sidewalks are dense but not complete, like in some new developments where it just ends mid-block, then, or if you have no protection to crossing, again, it's good potential, bad in reality. So the sort of solution to that is somewhat more complex, is to use route-based measures of connectivity. So now we're thinking about getting from A to B, how well does the network sort of serve different types of users. So this one is calculated between particular points. Right? So now you get penalized for having a curvilinear grid where you have to go far out of your way, or a poor network grid, which gets you there quickly but uncomfortably. So these are more closely related to what I would call realized connectivity. So what can you actually access with the network versus the potential? And you know, the downside, why doesn't everyone just do the route base? Well, when you're doing it for an entire region, like Portland shown at the top there, it's pretty resource intensive, both from an analysis technology point of view and data, right? And that's why Metro, when they're looking at a regional sketch, might choose a form-based measure, while Caltrans, which I'll talk a little more about later, or Atlanta might be looking at more localizers where they can use this route base. So I hope that distinction makes some sense to you. If not, we'll talk about it a little bit more. At this point, I'm sort of ready to actually do the measurement. Right? It seems like this would be up front, but there's some choices to make first. And the first step is actually kind of assembling the data. And most of these measures, you know, the more of these data categories you have, obviously the sort of more complete picture you're going to get of connectivity. But at a minimum, generally a connectivity analysis is going to require that you have your bicycle and pedestrian facilities, the basics, sidewalks, bike lanes, bike boulevards, multi-use paths. Ideally, you'll have intersection features, but we found that this was pretty new for a lot of agencies. They weren't used to tracking intersection data for this type of planning analysis. That was more like, oh, I think that's, you know, over in engineering or something. They thought about it more from an operations point of view. But we know from a lot of behavioral research, intersections are very important. Sometimes they can define a route if an intersection feels dangerous to cross. And then finally, there's supporting data. Things like slope can be really important in some places. And then all the things that cyclists and pedestrians share the road with, right? So there's motor vehicle traffic, the speed of that traffic. The mix of the traffic can be important, right? More heavy vehicles tend to make people feel less comfortable. And then potential obstacles, which at this point, very few agencies would have this data for a broad region, but they might have it locally, which is things like driveway accesses or parallel parking, all of these things that cause the space to be a little more complicated for bicyclists and pedestrians. There's a lot of data, and luckily there are quite a few projects underway to help standardize it, but right now it's a real issue. You choose a measure, but your data might not necessarily fit what that measure is expecting as inputs. Places categorize bike facilities in 100 different ways. The space, one of the most contested spaces right now, conceptually, I think, is the bike boulevard, or is it the neighborhood greenway, or is it the low-stress bikeway, or is it and different places you say it and they just have no idea what you're talking about. So that's something that we found to be a particular problem. In terms of metrics themselves, it's helpful to think about the different scales at which you can measure connectivity. At the most basic, connectivity can be measured on a single block, right? So in a sense, this street segment out here on Broadway is connecting this intersection to this one. So that's kind of the smallest unit you can think of connectivity. How well can you get from this end of the block to the other? And maybe you include the intersection if you have the data. Obviously, that would be too small to be of much planning use, but that's usually the building block of the larger analysis. Then you start thinking about either how those segments are arranged in space and what their quality is, or how they string together, and that would be the route-based methodology. So how does this link lead you to the next, which leads you to the next, and now we're clearly including things like intersection features, right? So once we've done that, once we've coded all of our network links for quality and seen how they fit together, and we've done this over an entire area, you sort of have to think of a way to aggregate that up to a meaningful scale, because no one wants to try to think about every link or every route individually. I mean, just the routes of this group in here would take me a year to look through and understand how connected are your networks from where you start and end. So the three ways that we mainly saw summarized, the dominant way that is still happening is just putting it on a map. So calculate the quality or the facility type that's on each link. Is there a sidewalk? Is there a bike lane? Is there something else? How long is it? How steep is it maybe? But then just put that on a map And it's kind of a qualitative way of then looking for gaps and for opportunities to make investments. The next sort of step up, maybe I would say, is sort of scoring to small areas. So how connected is this PSU area if we take the sum of all the routes in and out of it, or the density of links within it, or the number that are covered with bike facilities or sidewalks? You know, how does that add up to an area? And then those areas match up with other data that's important to planning. And then finally, this is fairly rare, but this is the sort of thing that places like Fort Collins were advocating for, that they wanted to do, had ambitions to do, is we want a network, we want a score that we can look at year to year, or compare this to our 10-year, 20-year, 30-year investment plan, and see how this package of investments is going to nudge our connectivity scores up for the whole network, if you're a regional agency or a city agency or something, have some other jurisdiction. Let me give you some examples. So here's this is actually our Jennifer Dills and my route quality index, which gives a score to every link and its connection to the next link based on some preference modeling we did with bicyclists riding around with GPS units. And in our concept, there's kind of a reference facility that represents kind of an adequate facility. So it would be like a quiet street without a bike lane, or a busier street with at least a striped bike lane. So that's kind of the middle there in gray. Anything worse than that in terms of connectivity is shaded in warmer colors and gets thinner. So the yellows and the reds in there are streets that have sort of a higher stress. Bicyclists would prefer them less. And in a map like this, qualitatively, you can kind of see where routes present barriers, or where maybe opportunities exist to connect, say, a trail to existing bicycle facilities without getting on the main street. So you can see these things, and they can work for small area planning, but it's really not consistent over time. If you had your map next year and you looked at it again, I'm not sure you would come to exactly the same conclusions, and you definitely wouldn't be able to say, yeah, I think this got 23% better with our plan. So that's sort of the downside of this mapping. So I mentioned the small area scores. You kind of sum it up, and this is a really ambitious project that's been undertaken by People for Bikes, the national advocacy organizations. They're working with cities and regions to try to apply a consistent methodology of network connectivity for cyclists. And they present their results at several scales, but one of them is at the census block. So taking the census block at the origin, they create a basket of destinations that people typically want to reach, like grocery stores and restaurants and schools and libraries and parks and all of these things we go to. And then they give us normalized score from 0 to 100 based on whether they can reach a sufficient number of those on a high quality route and in a reasonable sort of distance. So here it's a little bit different scale here, where the cool colors are actually better and the warm colors are worse. And if you saw the network overlaid, this actually happens to be the neighborhood I grew up in, and there's a highway and an interstate that caused that red area to be less connected than the others. So they're easier to compare over time, right? You could compare the scores from these same neighborhoods and same census blocks next year or in the 15-year plan to how it is now based on land use and network changes. So better comparison over time, maybe a little more objective, overlays with other data. I think it's more the way that places are heading. And then I mentioned that it's rarely been done to this extent, but you can calculate a connectivity score for the whole network. And here again is the bicycle network analysis method shown for 2 places, for Portland and for Knoxville. And you can see that Portland scores higher. You can kind of roughly think of it in like a 35. Most blocks are connected to about 35 maybe % of destinations that are reachable by a good quality network, roughly speaking. Portland got some press for getting a surprisingly low score. There are reasons for that. There are a lot of ways to measure connectivity, and one thing about this scoring system is it doesn't consider bike boulevards, which clearly are a kind of a backbone of our network. So again, what's the answer of how connected it is? It probably depends on how you measure it, but this is, I think, a pretty good start. I mentioned a little bit about other data it might overlay with. Part of the packaging is not just stopping at connectivity. We know that connectivity is related to a lot of things, including access to different, to bicycle connections or walking connections by different groups. This was from our case study in Fort Collins. Metro had a similar concept. They wanted to overlay where their network was more or less connected with measures of equity, so measures of income and poverty, education and race. And this is just one map showing the darker areas are higher poverty, and you can kind of see, just from an eye squint analysis methodology, that there are some areas which are poor and have relatively poor connectivity. These could be focuses in a planning process. So there are lots of things you can overlay, including sociodemographic data, safety, crash data. Does that seem to be related to problems in the network? Use data, something that we've been working a lot on in PSU. How does connectivity relate to actually getting people to bike more or walk more? So another thing that I just want to draw your attention to is I mentioned that we wanted to provide a kind of menu of options with different requirements that they require a different level of data and technical skill and an idea of what you get out of them. So we came up with these kind of standardized fact sheets for the different methods and measures that are commonly being used. The example shown here is the pedestrian level of traffic stress, which we applied to Baltimore to help answer that planning question they have. We have a sidewalk inventory, and they seem pretty complete. Now, what do we do with it? And so they learned to use a new method, the pedestrian level of traffic stress, and they saw that, well, I guess maybe it's not maybe quite as complete or as high quality as they might have thought it was throughout their area. So we have these for, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but probably 15 to 20 different measures that you kind of think through if you're working for an agency, and particularly if their resources are somewhat limited, you might be able to find a measure that can answer a planning question that doesn't take a huge amount of resources to pull off. I want to spend the last couple of minutes here before we hopefully have a little Q&A on one of our case studies. Like I said, there are 5 of these that we kind of laid out, and I think these make fun reads for any of you that are involved in planning or just interested in it. It really is. It was a peek behind the curtain for us, in a sense, that we, like I said, we just kind of parachuted into these ongoing planning processes where they said, yeah, we could use a little help, or we'd be happy to have another voice around the table. And we kind of saw how these things happen in reality on a time schedule, on a tight time frame, how ambitions kind of shift and measure. You have to circle back and back up to maybe a simpler measure, a different measure, because the data is just not coming in from jurisdiction or other. This, I would say, was probably one of the larger success stories. And I found it interesting because it's not the typical agency that would be doing a connectivity analysis. It's usually cities and very urban regions. But this was Caltrans District 4 in charge of the state roads, and they were struggling a little bit with kind of what to do in their long range plan. They understood these needs of local accessibility and understood they were kind of a player, but they weren't responsible for the facilities around theirs necessarily. So how did they approach the table? And they came up with, they'd already come up with a good idea. So all credit to them. And then we were able through this project to kind of help them think through a new analysis method that sort of fit it. And so what they did is they took corridors of their facilities. See, I don't think this guy works, but I can use the mouse. So this line in the center with all of the dots on it is one piece of a corridor that Caltrans manages and was interested in understanding how it impacts connectivity from one side to the other. And the method that ended up being used was at regular points which represented, I think it matched their sort of planning doctrine. People should be able to pass across the state highway at regular intervals. And so each of these points is a place where they're theoretically, could, or maybe should, if you want to say so, be a reasonable crossing. The lines you see are the actual ways across on local roads across the highway. In some cases, you have to go a long way out of your way to get across. There's a connectivity issue there. On the left is the all streets network. I told you before that the results can change. On the right is a network that's restricted to lower stress, sort of all ages and abilities pieces of the networks, and the crossings sort of get even sparser. For this, they assembled a routable bike network. Routable meaning that links know that they're connected to each other or that they're not, so that some pieces of the highway cross over. You can't cross there, or there's a barrier. They also had their state highway corridors, and they had some supporting data. And then, like I said, the metrics that they chose to use were kind of, it was a route directness measure. So how direct is the route across at these regular intervals for a cyclist? And they're planning to do the same thing for pedestrians, though we didn't do it as part of the project. And they packaged the results in some different ways just to try it out. I've already mentioned some different ways you can do it. The first was just a map. Right? So these are those same corridors, I think, or maybe they're different, but it's the same concept. The corridor is showing you on the left-hand side the all streets open to bikes, and on the right side the higher quality routes open to bikes, with the sort of color of the dot showing you the kind of the out of direction travel that was needed. Which the idea is that's going to make people less likely to be able to use a bike for that trip. It causes them to be somewhat isolated on one side or the other by bike. And so as you go from green to red, you're getting increasing out of direction travel to cross that network link up to 1 1/3 mile or so, which we cut it off at that point. Where the dots are missing on the right side is where there just wasn't a low stress crossing with a reasonable detour. No one's going to go 3, 4, or 5 times out of their way. We've seen that in research data. So that was one way, and that was really helpful, but it's a hard one to kind of set long-term benchmarking and policy by. You could look at the set of maps next year in your plan and hope that they look a little less red, but that's not exactly quantifiable. And so several other things were tried. This has ended up being the one. I mean, maybe they're showing their hand a little bit as a state agency. They still like their tables. So with all the graphs and things produced, this table was the simplest to kind of think about on a year-to-year basis and to bring into the planning process, to talk to other people and related agencies. And that was just, well, let's put all the potential crossings into bins by how far out of your way you have to go to get across our highway by bicycle. And let's just see how that distribution looks in different corridors, which helps them kind of choose corridors to prioritize. So where they saw a large share over toward the right, where people were having to go far out of their way, or maybe there just wasn't a low stress crossing, they prioritize those areas versus others. They can also compare these over time, and they can load in their 20-year planned facilities and sort of see if that improves it. If they're going to add a new crossing or connection across their roads, or if local agencies are, then hopefully these numbers improve over time. And I think I mentioned this. They are rolling this into their formal 20-year planning process on the bike side, and they're working on the methodology for the pedestrian side. So this is now, by doing the connectivity analysis, bicyclists and pedestrians suddenly have a voice at this table, where before they were interested but didn't really know how controlling the state highway they were really going to facilitate the bicycle and pedestrian use goals that their agency has. So it was really interesting, and shows how sort of, I think to me, how close a lot of agencies are. I think we're underestimating their sort of ambition for doing these sorts of analyses and doing something new. Is very receptive. I won't go through each of these, but I do think, having gotten to participate in this entire process, and it was a real learning experience for me. Like I said, definitely firmly on the research side. Generally, I only touch base with practice so often when I get to go on projects like this. But one thing that was clear is most agencies have a connectivity goal for biking and walking. But those that are measuring it, much less common. It's not easy. You sit around and talk about it for a while and realize that you just don't have the knowledge or the skills to do it, or the data perhaps. What we were seeing is that what was happening was mostly visual, mostly qualitative, but the questions that were being asked really sort of demanded some, either a quantification or some other way of standardizing the measure, just so, even if it's qualitative, make it more comparable over time. The pedestrian side is lagging behind on connectivity measures for sure. You probably noticed that I talked more about bicycling analyses, and I think in the end, I guess three of our 5 agencies were bike only, and then one did both, and Baltimore looked at the ped side. But the measures are just less well developed in research as well as in practice for pedestrian connectivity. That's a research area for all of you students out there to think about. It's mostly urban with a few exceptions. We don't know how well a lot of these tools will transfer to suburban and rural locations where networks are much more sparse, traffic speeds are higher. I think an important thing is that the measures are often modified. So what often happens is that there's a deadline and you don't have the right data, but you have some kind of similar data. So you plug that in, and then you're not quite sure how this method works because it's not well documented. So then you change that around, and by the end, you've really lost any of the research and support or validation for the measure. And that's something that agencies are realizing when they have, particularly if you have an outside group do the work for you, and then later you find out that it wasn't done in a standard way, now you've lost the sort of point of comparison. So I think that was an important lesson. Data standards are lacking, and also archiving data. A lot of these agencies would love to go back 10 years in their bicycle facilities, but they find they don't actually necessarily have the bike facilities 10 years ago. They were just overwritten or were never meant to be sort of saved and digitized. But like I said, in general, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm around this concept of connectivity, how to measure it, how to quantify it, how to even conceptualize it. So, I hope that some of you that are watching this webinar will share that enthusiasm and sort of think of ways it can be integrated into the planning process. It's a really powerful tool and seems to resonate with a lot of different groups. A little bit on what's next, and then I'll open it up to you. This is beyond the guidebook. This is more my personal take. This is what I would expect to see from connectivity in the next 5 or 10 years. I think the data standards are going to improve a lot. FHWA is throwing some weight and money behind standardizing bicycle and pedestrian facility definitions. It's quite possible that we'll have a nationally comparable bicycle and hopefully maybe pedestrian network in the not too near but not too distant horizon. I think there will be more turnkey connectivity analysis tools where so many agencies are asking for it. I think it's going to happen. There's pressure we need something that is just naturally consistent. We feed data in and we can compare it with all the jurisdictions in our region or with our peer cities. And we're working on one here at Portland State, so stay tuned. We're working on a sketch planning tool of bicycling connectivity, which is just starting up very soon. And maybe you'll hear about it here in some future venue. And then finally, I think that, there's going to be continued research understanding how these measures really relate to behavior. So are these measures really getting at what people care about, or are we just measuring things for the sake of measuring them? Do these numbers translate to more people of more ages and abilities using the network and feeling safer? With that, I will encourage you to at least take a look through some of the points that interested you today. The guidebook is freely downloadable. There will be links in this presentation that's posted, and you can also find more information about my work related to federal highways work, and then all of the great bike and ped work that's going on by our researchers here at Portland State. And with that, I'll turn it over to questions or discussion. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
My name is, I'm not sure, but I can
I'm willing to help with pedestrians work because I'm also acquainted with at least one other person on participate in and for virtual, they had a lecture about a while back, and he said that he wanted to get it, but we haven't heard from him yet. I mean, I said that probably not to you, but they want to hear it.
Yeah, you know, see if you can go through a little bit of the whole more case study. They did do some work on. There is a version of pedestrian level traffic, it's just that it incorporates some accessibility variables for those with vision impairment and physical impairment. So I think that can be really here.
Yeah, and just to follow up there, the data collection here.
Thank you. The questions are thoughts. I'm always open. Something's anytime you categorize. Yeah.
Working with fire and rescue for those 2 quarters or so, and something they've expressed concern about is bike ped facilities that inhibit their response. Now, I've been tried to be clear about the whole point of these facilities is to reduce the number of responses they ever have to make for traffic.
Yeah.
But these don't prevent fires, these don't prevent heart attacks and other things.
Sure.
Those things, they still have emergency. So there's been some pushback from PFR on sorts of facilities that they can't get their vehicles around. What sort of discussion pathways in have you been seeing, say, nationwide or locally, or sort of devices or techniques exist to walk that?
Yeah, probably more on the in terms of those on streets. From a connectivity perspective, though, I mean, that would be a great case for connectivity in the planning process. Where are these facilities that feel like, are impeding their progress? Could we see what the connectivity value is of those? And so that might help you determine how far you want to go down the road of trying to make it work for both user groups, or is there, is there an alternative road in some cases that makes that necessary? And I can also see them kind of treating it in the way that Caltrans did in terms of in some ways, the facilities they need to use are in conflict with kind of maybe the ideal environment. So how can you kind of minimize that conflict between the 2 use needs? And I think it can help you, if nothing else, kind of identify the opportunities maybe for both sides winning. There may be a nearby facility that's just missing a link or a intersection crossing of being a great bike facility maybe parallel to a street that's used for emergency response. It's a good question. Yeah, not one because we didn't work with an agency doing planning around that per se. I'm giving a lot of thought. I will now. Yeah.
So, one of direction travel that seems to be mostly distance-based,
Yeah.
which I think is very important. I wonder if you can talk about one of direction travel in terms of turns and complexity of the route. For example, the 20s bikeway is an example of something people are complaining about a lot, even though the total out of direction travel is somewhere between 2 to 4 blocks. It's not much distance, but you have to really pay attention to make sure that you're safe.
It is a real distinction between the. So I mentioned the level of complexity. You move from just assuming all streets could get you south to north, right? So moving a good step up, which is, well, let's look at the with bike facilities like the 20s bikeway.
But then that last step, which is challenging, is kind of what our work is centered around. Let's ignore just the facility designation, just look at how the route functions. And so something like the map of St. John that put up with the route quality index does take that into account. So every one of those turns results in a penalty and becomes the equivalent of outer direction travel. It's like mental distance, that if I have to make 5 turns per mile, that's costing me something like a third or a half a mile every mile I go. And if those intersections are difficult crossings, it penalizes it even more. So if it's a busy street with no signal, like where you're crossing, I don't know, there's still a couple of crossings there where you're somewhat unprotected, right, on the 20s, and that costs you more. So that's getting beyond just the facility base into the real quality weighted network idea, which that you're getting at. So yeah, if you have an interest in some of that actually on the more complex measures and how that's been handled. Great question. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm sorry if you've already said it and I missed it, but what sort of considerations have been made about how you're going to affect the network connectivity with more
That's a good question. I would say probably not enough is one answer. The other, though, is just sort of like the map you saw for Poland. There's an idea that if the connectivity being provided by the facilities is sort of subpar in a way that's patterned so that low income communities are benefiting less, then it kind of falls under any urban service that we're looking at from an environmental justice perspective. That is, regardless of these other issues, there should be a basic, safe, comfortable network in place for people who do want to bike and walk. And I think the issues you're getting at are ones that we should be thought about alongside that. It doesn't mean that once your connectivity analysis, you go in here and help bicyclists, just go do it. And just say the score says we should do that. It'll get us up to 35. Yeah, no. So it's good. And that was part of your focus in sort of seeing how it can embed into the broader planning process. So it's just kind of another voice at the table. Like this would be the connectivity. Certainly, it's important that you cannot just let that be your one guiding star and think about the other social, cultural, community, historical impacts in some of those areas. It's an important question. Probably a good one. Do we have any from the web?
Yeah.
Or should we? I want to be sure to leave time for anyone else.
What kind of data are we use to populate these models? Things like real-time cell phone data, this person suggests drones.
Yeah. Drones for data collection. I would say it's a little tangential to that, so that's when we're talking about behavior use data. I would say the thing that is hottest right now is OpenStreetMap data for the networks, which is pretty interesting in that it's it's kind of a Wikipedia for streets. Although agencies a lot of times are the main contributors to it. Portland network is mostly Metro and City of Portland contributing, but it's a standardized format for understanding networks. The neat thing is that it's all streets, so it includes all the small local connectors that are important for biking and walking. So a lot of agencies and federal highways are very interested in considering OpenStreetMap as the kind of the network model to use. Some issues with it would be the main one. And on the research side, definitely all these new these smartphone data collections of where people are actually riding, when they're riding, where they're not riding. It's important for identifying gaps. On the research side of validating and supporting these measures, that's the gold standard now. Certainly, it's giving people real behavior. It's a good one. Anything else from the room or out in the ether? All right, then thank you all again for coming in. Please get outside.